because we are in February, we are really starting to head headlong into the growing season, and if we have been preparing our area over winter, we are just about season ready. If you haven't, don't worry, there's plenty to be doing before we start getting anything sown and possibly in the ground. Now, we may already have been perusing those seed catalogues, buying our seeds and getting ready, but when it comes to our growing space, we also need to think about where we are going to grow things. Now, if you are new to gardening, you might be thinking that you need to get everything done at once, and actually that's just not the case. Take it slowly, because you should be enjoying your growing. However, more experienced growers or people with an allotment already set up, we may be thinking about possibly looking at our crop rotation. So if we are going to be growing things like our root veg, our legumes, our brassicas and our fruiting veg, we need to maybe be thinking about our crop rotation. So if we are looking at our legumes, for example, lots of beautiful nitrogen going on with these particular plants, and actually what follows them really well is something like our brassicas. Now, brassicas do take a lot of energy out of the ground, which is why following legumes is a good idea. Now, after our brassicas, which are our leafy veg, we may then have our fruiting veg, so things like our tomatoes and our pumpkins. If you've got seeds on the inside, it is technically a fruit. And then following those would be our root veggies, so things like our potatoes, our carrots and our parsnips. And then the whole rotation of those four produce really starts again. Now, if you're a no-dig gardener to a certain extent, you can just basically think about what the sunlight is like, because actually what you're doing is you're adding a lot of the nutrients into the ground, which may be missing if you don't do the crop rotation and you don't do a no-dig. Now, what we also have to think about as well is which plants do and do not get along with each other. So for example, if we're thinking about our potatoes, they don't like being near to tomatoes. Now, technically they are both a part of the nightshade family, but they're a bit of a dysfunctional family. They don't like going next to each other, and especially if we're thinking about airborne diseases like blight, we need to be keeping those far enough apart. So on my plot, I do have a number of beds, but I'm quite lucky because I have a large space. But if you do not have a very large space, then that 4-bed rotation is a really good idea. So I'm just going to have a little walk through my plot and see what my plans are for this year. So to start off with, right at the very end of the plot, in this sort of walled area of the allotment, I have got my rhubarb. It's starting to come up really nicely, and because these are perennials, these don't actually move. What I do need to do is give these a good mulching over, and they are already season ready. Technically, they are also a vegetable, although we do treat them like our fruits. Now, at the top end of my top plot, I have got these 3 beds, which last year didn't do particularly well because I hadn't really replenished the soil and they really needed some attention. Now this year I have actually gone no dig on one of the beds, which is where my garlic is, and then I have my 2 other beds which I'm actually going to be getting my potatoes in. Now, I had potatoes in here 3 years ago. They did really well, and actually if I'm thinking about that crop rotation, this is the ideal place for them to go. So I have 2 beds here which are going to be really good for my new potatoes as well as my seconds as well. Now, possibly one of my favourite areas is this archway. It is actually made out of an old polytunnel frame which was gifted to me, and I've actually got this wire mesh all the way round, and this is for 2 different produce. I have got my runner beans which go over these, but they are also for my climbing squashes. Now, I did actually have runner beans in this end of this polytunnel frame last year, and then I had the squashes down the other end. So all I'm going to do with this is I'm literally going to switch them over. So I'm going to have the runner beans down at the far end, and then I'm going to have my squashes growing up over this side. Just next to this polytunnel frame, I also have what were my squashes beds last year. Now, because I am no dig, I am actually going to be doing the squashes there again, because I know that the soil is going to be replenished, it's going to have enough nutrients. What I also know is because of the sunlight, that this area gets a good deal of sun, which is absolutely perfect for growing my pumpkins and my squashes. And of course, I've got this to actually enable it to grow over. This is just near to the potatoes. They're absolutely fine. They're quite happy companions, and this is going to look absolutely stunning. Now just down from the plot here I actually have some other frames which are like garden arches. Now I originally got those for my runner beans, but what I found is that the runner beans were just too heavy, and quite often they would actually be dragged over, particularly if we had any high winds around sort of August, September time. So what I do with those instead is I still have my climbing veg, but I have my climbing French beans, and they are light enough to actually be really, really happy. And again, they're getting a lot of sun and they grow really, really well in that area. Now when we have a really large growing area, we have to be a little bit kind to ourselves. Obviously still thinking about growing what we really love, but we also need to be thinking about what might grow without any intervention other than maybe a little bit of pruning and mulching at certain times of the year. Now what I have here is I have a whole selection of herb beds. So I do have some of this which is curry plant. This isn't the kind you can eat though, you'd be a bit poorly if you did, but I do have some sage, I have some thyme, I have some oregano. I also have another bed which is filled with my tea herbs. So I have got my bergamot in there, I've got my lemon balm and my lemon verbena, as well as chamomile. Next to that, in the ground, very, very controversially, I have some mint. Now this has actually been in the ground here for around 4 years, and I have to say so far it hasn't actually spread. And similar to the controversy of having mint in this bed, in the other bed I actually have some of my horseradish, and again it's been in the bed for about 3 years and it has actually managed so far to be very, very self-contained. Now these will actually just quite happily grow. They're also quite drought tolerant as well, so if we're thinking about our hot summers, having a really nice herb area is brilliant because it will almost look after itself, and it's also absolutely brilliant when we come to thinking about what we're going to be cooking. Now this is an area where I have maybe a little bit of a love-hate situation, and it is actually my brassicas cage. Now if we're thinking about crop rotation, this is not something that I rotate, and there's a very good reason for that. Obviously I'm no dig, so all the nutrients are being added and replenished each year by using that method, but also because on these allotments we have something called club root. Now club root can be sort of worked on if we're adding things like lime into our soil, but I don't really like the idea of that, so I use this for that reason, but also because I can't really move this cage, and this is actually scaffold netting, and it is really, really fine mesh. Now the reason for this is it doesn't net anything in except for sunlight and water. Now if we're thinking about pollinators, actually our brassicas don't need pollinators, and this is here to keep out any of those caterpillars and those butterflies. So it's actually worth thinking about where you're going to put your brassicas to make sure that you are protecting them from any so-called garden pests, but also having a look and thinking, do we have any diseases in the soil which may also impact our growing? So now I'm on the bottom plot, and the bottom plot is really quite heavily focused on my fruit bushes. Having said that, right next to my fruit bushes I have got my flowers. Now these do include my dahlias, and I have a combination of the great big pom-poms, but I also have the open ones, and there's a reason for that. Next to those I have got my spring bulbs bed, I have got peonies, I have got lupins, I have got digitalis, and it's also where I'm going to be putting my sweet peas. Now I also have lots of lavender, and there's a very good reason for this, and it's all about the pollinators. If we can attract our pollinators to our growing areas where we have fruit, then the hope is that they'll come for the flowers, but they'll hang around to help to pollinate our fruit. Now I do have a fruit cage here which obviously does have netting to keep the birds away from my fruit, although I have so many fruit bushes, not all of it in my fruit cage. And what I have, which is very different to my brassicas cage, is the netting is actually quite wide, and this will enable the pollinators to get in as well as to get out. So really think about when you're organising your fruit area, have you got something that is actually going to encourage those pollinators and keep them hanging around? So here I am at the bottom of my bottom plot, and this is where a lot of my herbaceous perennials are, and that is my asparagus, my cardoons, my artichokes, and this area just behind me here last year actually had my potatoes in there. Now in theory I need to be following that up with some legumes, however I already have that area sorted right at the end of the top plot. So what I'm actually going to try in this area this year are actually my leeks. So I'm going for alliums. Now that's a big space and it's a really good job, but actually I really like them. Now I already have, just down the way there, I already have my onion sets in the ground, so that's going to be quite nice, keeping the allium theme going. And then I have the polytunnel. Now again, the polytunnel is replenished every single year, so the kinds of things I'm going to go in there are quite normal. They're the ones that I usually have in the polytunnel. So it's things like my sweet potatoes, my tomatoes, and most definitely my cucumbers. And at the very, very far end, I have my special bed, which is just saved particularly for parsnips. Now these aren't going to be edible parsnips. These are actually going to be the ones I'm going to let go to seed, so that I can actually gather some more parsnip seeds in the future. And then again round the back I have more rhubarb, keeping itself nicely mulched over, and its own little microclimate between the polytunnel and the hedging. So lots of things to be thinking about, lots of things to be doing before we start getting stuff in the ground, and it's most definitely all about planning what we're going to do with all of our growing space, so we have a very, very successful 2024 with our harvest.